In May 1976, the Cannes Film Festival was rocked by a production so visceral it was immediately branded a criminal act in its own country. This was Nagisa Oshima's In the Realm of the Senses, the first major art house film to feature unsimulated intimacy between its stars. In the spring of 1976, the Croisette in Cannes was the epicenter of a cinematic explosion that didn't just push the boundaries of artistic freedom, it shattered them with surgical precision. While the Mediterranean sun glinted off the jewelry of the global elite, a single film was smuggled onto the screen that would leave the audience in a state of clinical shock. This was Nagisa Oshima's In the Realm of the Senses, a production so visceral it was immediately branded a criminal act in its own country. To the Western critics who rose in a thunderous standing ovation, the film was a triumph of radical honesty, a million-dollar masterpiece of obsession. But through the lens of forensic psychology, we look past the avant-garde accolades and into the anatomy of a crime. Behind the applause lay a high-security biological trap, and the woman at its center, 23-year-old Eiko Matsuda, was about to become the most famous sacrificial lamb in the history of Asian cinema. The financial paradox of this masterpiece was staggering. While the Japanese government was busy issuing criminal warrants for obscenity, the film was conquering the international market, eventually grossing over $15 million, a colossal sum for a non-Hollywood project in the mid-70s. This was the peak of the sin wave, a low-budget experiment transformed into a global goldmine. But the investigative truth reveals that this $15 million empire was built on the unsimulated trauma of its lead star. The industry had extracted the rawest parts of Eiko Matsuda's humanity to sell as unfiltered realism to a voyeuristic global audience. As noted in a later forensic analysis of the production, the 1976 premiere wasn't just a screening, it was a forensic unmasking of Japanese taboo. While the world marveled at the unsimulated truth, the woman in the center, Eiko Matsuda, was entering a 35-year mental prison. The industry extracted her vulnerability for a global spectacle but left her with a life sentence of social assassination. While director Nagisa Oshima was being toasted as a visionary genius who had liberated the Japanese spirit, Eiko Matsuda was being treated as a biological specimen. To the director, she wasn't an artist. She was a medium through which he could conduct a biopsy of sexual repression. He used a calculated legal shield, registering the film as a French production to avoid Japanese law, ensuring his own immunity while leaving his lead actress exposed to the full heat of a cultural firestorm. The success of the film became Matsuda's professional execution. While Oshima's name was archived in the history of high art, Eiko was effectively erased by her own culture, branded as a moral pariah. "I believed in the revolution," Eiko Matsuda would later recall her voice, a record of a spirit in permanent retreat. "I thought we were making history. I didn't realize that in this industry the director gets the future and the actress gets the grave. I gave them my actual pulse, and in return they gave me a label that I could never wash off." The investigative math of In the Realm of the Senses is cold and absolute. The $15 million profit was the price of a woman's future. The standing ovation in Cannes was merely the sound of a gilded cage being locked from the outside. Eiko Matsuda didn't just star in a film. She was the victim of an experiment that proved the sexual revolution only had one survivor, the man behind the camera. She remained a ghost in the machine of Oshima's legend until her final lonely breath in a French hospital in 2011, a tragic reminder that in the anatomy of fame, the masterpiece is often built on the bones of the person who gave everything to make it real. The secret she took to her grave was that the realm of the senses was never a place of liberation. It was a high-definition trap where the only exit was total professional destruction. To understand the forensic architecture of the betrayal, we must first look at the blueprint Nagisa Oshima used to construct his psychological trap. He didn't just want to direct a movie. He wanted to perform a cinematic reconstruction of a 1936 national trauma that still pulsed in the veins of the Japanese psyche. The story followed the real-life figure of Sada Abe, a servant who entered into a lethal, obsessive sexual relationship with a hotel owner. For Oshima, the project was a high-stakes experiment in unmasking a culture through the lens of a crime scene. But to bring this biological realism to life, he knew he couldn't use a traditional actress. He needed someone disposable, someone whose professional future could be traded for a single month of unsimulated intensity. The narrative of In the Realm of the Senses is a spiral of total social asphyxiation. It depicts a servant and her master retreating from the world, isolating themselves within the thin paper walls of a Japanese inn to pursue a desire that rejects every law of man and state. The affair was designed to reach a visceral terminal climax, a sequence where the protagonist accidentally strangles her lover to death during a moment of peak intimacy, followed by the gruesome actual mutilation of his body. To capture this on celluloid, Oshima demanded more than talent. He demanded a total emotional surrender that would blur the lines between a performer and a perpetrator. The casting of 23-year-old Eiko Matsuda was a calculated move by the puppet master. A theatrical rebel with a reputation for being unconventional, Matsuda was the perfect vessel for Oshima's forensic ambitions. Before the cameras even started rolling, the director spent months molding her into a state of total psychological dependency. He convinced her that the blood and bone honesty he required was her only path to artistic immortality. He positioned himself as her intellectual savior, leading her to believe that by sacrificing her privacy, she was leading a revolution. Oshima's clinical detachment was evident in his instructions. He wasn't looking for a portrayal of passion. He was looking for a biological record. He later admitted with a chilling pragmatism, "I didn't want acting. I wanted the biological reality of desire." Eiko was the only one brave enough to give me her actual pulse. To him, her actual pulse was just another production asset to be extracted and sold. The investigative truth of this Sada A blueprint reveals a masterclass in predatory manipulation. While Matsuda believed she was part of an elite artistic circle making history, the director was merely using her youth and her courage as fuel for his own legacy. He had built a $15 million empire on the promise of truth, but he ensured that the woman providing that truth was stripped of her defenses long before the first scene was shot. "I believed in him," Matsuda would later recount in a voice marked by the wreckage of her career. "I thought we were making history. I didn't realize that I was the one being made into history while he kept his future. I was the specimen in his lab, and the immortality he promised was just a label for my professional execution." As the production moved toward the infamous 30-day closed set, the trap was fully set. The blueprint of 1936 had been modernized into a high-definition cage. Eiko Matsuda was no longer a person. She was a biological prop in a reconstruction of a crime, unaware that the real strangulation occurring wasn't in the script. It was the systematic removal of her right to a normal life recorded in 35 mm and smuggled into the annals of film history. The forensic reality of the 30-day shoot for In the Realm of the Senses was one of absolute sensory asphyxiation. Inside a claustrophobic soundstage in Tokyo, the air was thick with the scent of ozone from high-voltage lighting and the unmistakable tang of unsimulated trauma. This wasn't a creative collaboration. It was a high-stakes psychological siege. Director Nagisa Oshima had instituted a no-simulation mandate that turned the production into a biological laboratory. There were no body doubles to absorb the physical impact, no safety nets to protect the stars' reputations, and no simulated emotions allowed. Every breath, every tremor, and every drop of sweat was a recorded physiological event extracted from Eiko Matsuda like marrow from a bone. The anatomy of the set was designed to break down the barrier between the performer and the specimen. Under the searing glare of studio lights that pushed the temperature of the room into a feverish haze, Matsuda was forced to perform unscripted acts of intimacy for hours on end. The closed set wasn't designed for her privacy, but for her total isolation. Severed from the outside world, she was trapped in a high-pressure cage where the only reality was the director's demand. Analysis of the footage from this period reveals a woman in a state of profound sensory overload, her nervous system vibrating at a frequency that no amount of acting talent could ever fake. The most chilling evidence of this industrial violation is captured in a later psychological assessment of the production. As noted in The Silent Scream of Eiko Matsuda, in the bedroom scenes of Ai no Corrida, the camera functions as a predatory eye. Forensic analysis of the footage shows Eiko in a state of acute neurological exhaustion. Oshima didn't direct a scene. He directed a biological event knowing that unsimulated truth was the highest-selling commodity in the European market. He was monetizing a woman's neurological collapse under the guise of avant-garde liberation. The visceral toll on Matsuda was ignored by a crew that was sworn to the director's vision. While the cameras rolled, the 32-year-old actress was being processed like raw material. A camera operator who witnessed the 30-day siege later provided a haunting deposition of the atmosphere. The tension was biological. You could smell the fear in the room. Eiko would look at the camera not as an artist, but as a prisoner looking for a way out. But Oshima would just keep the film running, waiting for her to break. He wanted the exhaustion. He wanted the wreckage. Oshima's clinical voyeurism was absolute. He viewed Matsuda's psychological boundaries as obstacles to be removed. He would later justify the trauma with a coldness that defined his career. "I didn't want a performance. I wanted the actual pulse of the human animal. If the actress was terrified, then the film was honest. This honesty was a debt that Eiko Matsuda would be forced to pay for the rest of her life, while the director used the resulting footage to build a $15 million legend. I felt like my skin was being peeled off frame by frame. Matsuda would later recount her words, serving as a forensic record of her dismantling. The lights were so hot and the silence of the director was so cold. I realized that the more I suffered, the more perfect the shot became. I wasn't an actress anymore. I was just the meat on the altar of his art. I gave him my soul because he told me it was the only way to be free, but I was just building my own cage. The investigative truth of the 30-day set is that In the Realm of the Senses wasn't a film about liberation. It was an anatomical record of a woman's professional execution. The unsimulated intimacy was the hook, but the unsimulated trauma was the real product. As the final wrap was called, Oshima had his $15 million masterpiece, but Eiko Matsuda was left with a shattered psyche and a neurological debt that no standing ovation in Cannes could ever settle. She had survived the realm of the senses, but she would never survive the wreckage of the set that stole her future. The forensic reality of the production of In the Realm of the Senses was defined by a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. To the world, Nagisa Oshima was a brave artistic provocateur, but to the legal system he was a man who had engineered a multi-million-dollar deception to insulate himself from the consequences of his own vision. The most chilling dollar move of the 1976 production was the calculated decision to register the project as a French production. This wasn't a choice driven by international collaboration. It was a high-stakes legal shield. By placing the film under the ownership of a French company, Oshima ensured that the developed celluloid, the physical evidence of the unsimulated acts, would remain beyond the reach of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police. The investigative truth of the set was one of high-tension smuggling. Because no Japanese laboratory would touch the graphic, undeveloped footage without reporting it to the authorities, the raw film had to be packed into secret crates and shipped out of Tokyo like contraband. This created a biological and professional risk that was distributed with clinical unfairness. If those crates had been opened by Japanese customs, the raw film would have been ruined by the light, and the performers would have been arrested on the spot for public indecency. Oshima had his French papers ready to claim he was merely an employee of a foreign entity, but Eiko Matsuda had no such protection. Her face was the evidence, her body was the crime. As one camera operator who witnessed the secret packaging of the reels later testified, the atmosphere was paranoid. We knew if the police walked in, Eiko would be the one they handcuffed. They couldn't arrest a French contract, but they could arrest a Japanese woman. Oshima had his legal exit strategy mapped out. He was the architect, but she was the decoy. The financial exploitation behind this smuggled masterpiece was total. While the film went on to generate over $15 million in international revenue and home video residuals, the accounting for its lead star was a forensic void. Eiko Matsuda had taken 100% of the physical and legal risk, yet she received $0 in back-end residuals. She was a low-cost hire for a production that used her as a human shield against the law. To the director in the studio, she was not a partner in a revolution. She was a disposable asset, whose compensation ended the moment the last secret crate was loaded onto a plane for Paris. The film was safe in Paris, Eiko Matsuda would later recall with a sharpness that cuts through the avant-garde myth. It was processed in a French lab protected by French laws and monetized by European distributors. I was the only one left in Tokyo to face the fire. The director had his French shield. I just had my ruined name. This was the production scandal that the film critics at Cannes chose to ignore. The standing ovation was for a piece of smuggled celluloid that had already been washed clean of its ethical bloodstains in a Parisian laboratory. But back in Japan, the forensic toll was just beginning to be tallied. Eiko Matsuda wasn't just an actress in a film. She was a participant in a high-stakes shell game where the director walked away with the millions and the legacy, while she was left standing at the docks holding nothing but a life sentence of cultural assassination. The Realm of the Senses was a $15 million empire, but its foundation was built on the cold-blooded sacrifice of a woman who was never intended to see a single cent of the profit. While the reels of In the Realm of the Senses were being celebrated in the high society theaters of Europe as a breakthrough in human expression back in Tokyo, the air was cooling into a lethal silence. For Nagisa Oshima, the fallout was a badge of honor that cemented his status as a master of cinema. But for Eiko Matsuda, the aftermath was an anatomical demolition of her very existence. Japan didn't just ban the film, they performed a soul blacklisting of the woman within it. In the rigid traditionalist framework of the late 70s, Matsuda was stripped of her professional identity and rebranded as a biological pollutant. This wasn't a career setback, it was a public execution. The forensic reality of the backlash was a masterclass in industrialized slut-shaming. As the film's notoriety grew, the Japanese media bypassed the director's political provocations to conduct a brutal character biopsy of its lead star. She was no longer viewed as an actress who had taken an immense artistic risk. She was branded with the lethal labels of immoral, indecent, and depraved. The Japanese press in 1976 delivered a chilling verdict that reflected the national mood. Eiko Matsuda is not an actress, she is a stain on the national character. This label functioned as a permanent professional execution, ensuring that no mainstream studio from Toho to Shochiku would ever dare to put her name on a call sheet again. The disparity in the faded glories ledger was visceral. While Oshima traveled the world to receive accolades protected by his French legal shield and the inherent double standards of the industry, Eiko Matsuda was left to rot in a social exile. She was treated as a faded curiosity, a woman whose face was synonymous with a crime rather than a performance. The industry that had extracted the miracle of her raw honesty now treated her like a biohazard. Every door in the Tokyo film world was locked from the inside, leaving her with a $15 million legacy that she could neither spend nor escape. I walked down the street and people looked through me as if I were a ghost. Matsuda would later recount her voice a record of a spirit in permanent retreat. I had given them my truth, my body, and my pulse, and in return they gave me a grave. In Japan, I was already dead. They were just waiting for the body to catch up. This was the public execution that the avant-garde elite in Paris chose to ignore. They saw the revolutionary on the screen, but they didn't see the woman who could no longer buy groceries in her own neighborhood without being whispered about as a pariah. The investigative truth of this chapter is clear. The sexual revolution was a high-definition trap with a gendered exit strategy. Forced by the crushing weight of cultural rejection, Matsuda fled to France not for a career, but for survival. She traded the big house of Japanese cinema for a lonely apartment in a foreign land, a ghost in the machine of a revolution that had used her as fuel, and then discarded the wreckage in the shadows of a $15 million masterpiece. The master had his legend. The sacrificial lamb had her exile. For 35 years, while the world continued to consume the unsimulated intensity of 1976, the woman at the center of those frames was living out a slow-motion biological sentence in a foreign land. Eiko Matsuda didn't just move to France. She was a refugee from a culture that had surgically removed her future. While In the Realm of the Senses was archived in museums as a milestone of human expression, Eiko's real-life reality was a forensic record of social and financial starvation. She lived in the shadows of the very empire she helped build an icon on the screen, but an impoverished ghost in the street. The forensic accounting of this legacy reveals a chilling void. By the time of her death in 2011, the film had generated over $15 million in international revenue and home video sales, cementing Nagisa Oshima as a deity of world cinema. Yet Eiko Matsuda spent her final years in obscurity, her bank account a reflection of the industry's total lack of accountability. There were no royalty checks for the trauma she endured, no medical fund for the neurological debt she carried, and exactly $0 provided for the 30 years of professional execution she suffered. She had been processed by the high art machine and then discarded once her shock value had been fully monetized. As actor Anson Williams noted, with the clinical sharpness that defines, they used her like a battery. They drained her of her youth and her courage to power a masterpiece, and then they threw her in the trash when she was empty. In the ledger of Hollywood and the global elite, she wasn't a partner, she was a consumable resource. The psychological decay was absolute. Eiko spent her final decades as a woman haunted by her own image, a captured soul frozen in 35 mm. Every time a remastered version of the film was celebrated at a festival, she was forced to relive the 30 days in that Tokyo soundstage, a prisoner of a loop that she could never break. In her final interview, her voice was a testament to the life that had been stolen under the guise of liberation. I never came home. My soul stayed in that room in 1976, and the world just watched the footage. They saw the freedom, but I was the only one who felt the bars of the cage. When the end finally came in 2011, Eiko Matsuda was 68 years old. She died in France, far from the country that had blacklisted her soul and almost entirely forgotten by the industry that had sold her pulse to the world for $15 million. There was no national mourning in Japan, no tribute from the studios that had profited from her sacrifice. Her death was as silent as the closed set. She had once inhabited a cold clinical finale to a life that had been sacrificed on the altar of a director's ego. The investigative truth of Eiko Matsuda is a searing indictment of the avant-garde. It proves that high art is often just a high-definition cover for a woman's professional execution. The film claims to celebrate the ultimate surrender of desire, but the forensic reality shows that only one person was forced to surrender her entire existence. The secret Eiko took to her grave was a haunting realization that would echo through the history of cinema. The sexual revolution only had one survivor, the man behind the camera. Nagisa Oshima walked away with the legend and the millions. Eiko Matsuda walked away with nothing but a life sentence of exile. In the end, In the Realm of the Senses wasn't a breakthrough for women. It was a captured autopsy of a career proving that in the anatomy of fame, the masterpiece is always built on the bones of the person who wasn't allowed to survive the frame. The lights have finally gone down, but the debt of those 30 days remains unpaid, a permanent stain on the conscience of a billion-dollar industry. A billion-dollar industry. A billion